Hello. Well, I'm sitting here in the capital city of one of the greatest democracies on earth, London, in the United Kingdom, and I'm in my last few hours before I get on my flight back home to one of the other great seats of democracy. And I've had about 36 hours to think about what's happened in my country, and as well to look back on what happened in this country where I stand now a few months ago. And of course what I'm referring to is, first, the election of Donald J. Trump to the presidency of the United States, and second, to Brexit, to the unlinking of Great Britain from the rest of the European Union. And it strikes me that I think many of the pundits have sort of gotten this thing wrong, and I think many of the people representing or purporting to represent political movements on the left as well as on the right have also gotten wrong the zeitgeist, gotten wrong what accounts for these seismic changes. If you ask many people, they would say this is the result of massive discontent on the part of many working people, and the feeling that they're disconnected from their society, that they're disenfranchised, that their government doesn't support them in any material or ethical or legal way. And to some extent that's very true for both countries. It is certainly true that an elite class has risen in both Great Britain and the United States of America, and that class of elites has by and large shunted aside, or perhaps more charitably forgotten about, the concerns of a great many of the people, their fellow citizens. So I think that that's very true. But what I think is not so true is the actual numbers involved. I think what's not true is the representation, is the sheer force of the vote expressed both here in the UK and in the United States. Behind that vote is certainly discontent, but also behind that vote, in fact, is a great deal of xenophobia, of actually racism, of bigotry. And it's quite easy to forget that, at least in the United States, the statistics that sort of cover the economic status of the people who indeed voted for Donald Trump and made him the president-elect suggest something a little bit more complicated. They suggest, in fact, that a lot of people who are actually doing fairly well voted for Donald Trump. So this is an interesting mix. It's not merely the people who sort of work hard to move the gears of society along, who feel like they've been left behind by that society and by the people who run that society. It's not merely the expression of anger by those people. It's also a very nativist strain of anger directed toward people who are the other, toward people who in fact look different, come from different places to begin with. And we shouldn't forget that. And we also shouldn't allow the pundits, we shouldn't allow people who purport to mean well for us, for our societies, to foist an overly simplistic story on us, because in fact it's not the full story. And by and large, I would suggest that in the case of Hillary Clinton, she certainly was in so many ways a member, a representative of the status quo. And her story can indeed be placed in stark contrast to that of Bernie Sanders, who comes from humble beginnings, as, by the way, did Hillary Clinton, but took a different political road and perhaps genuinely captured the zeitgeist, a movement in the United States toward fairness, toward civil justice. And he shouldn't be denied his due. But we would really be fooling ourselves to think that what just happened in the past 36 hours was merely the rumblings of an angry populace who had felt disenfranchised and left behind. It wasn't simply that. It was something else. And indeed, it was something far darker, because to a great extent, for decades, the writing has been on the wall. And anyone in the United States who cared to vote, anyone in the United States who cared to educate themselves about what it meant to be a citizen in our constitutional republic should have taken notice long ago. And in fact, should have educated themselves to the extent that they realized that there were certain people who did not mean them well, but perhaps were saying the right words and were sort of capturing some visceral sentiments that they themselves shared, but in fact weren't well-meaning. Nevertheless, many of the same people who voted for Donald Trump also voted in many cycles of elections for people who certainly did not represent their best interests at heart. And they voted repeatedly over decades for the same kind of people, for the same political caste. And it's disingenuous, to say the least, to say that somehow, first of all, Donald Trump represents a stark change, a stark contrast from that group of people, that group of, shall we say, conservative elites. He doesn't. He's a member of the 1%. He has espoused many of their ideals. He, in fact, is no different than they are. Perhaps the only difference between he and them is that he has never engaged in the formal political process as a candidate, and I sincerely doubt he's engaged much in the political process apart from throwing around money to various political candidates and causes that line his pockets. He hasn't engaged in it as an activist citizen. So he's a Trojan horse. And I think what galls me the most is, after all of this, I look back on this and I see it merely as the most extreme in a series of exercises that involve many, many people, a good number of whom feel disenfranchised, but some of whom feel merely that they should be somehow privileged in their society, that they somehow represent the origins of their society, that they somehow represent the one group of people who should have the greatest power. And this has happened again and again. Let's make no mistake. The election of Donald Trump may be an outlier in many respects. It's certainly not an outlier in the sense that it's different than the sort of spasms of ballot box activism by people who either have little experience with the ballot box, or in fact people who don't educate themselves sufficiently. And bear in mind when I say that, when I invoke the phrase educate themselves insufficiently, I'm not insulting their intelligence. I'm not calling them stupid. I am saying that they haven't been paying attention. They haven't been bothering to educate themselves. They've been lazy. They've been lazy in the sense of their civic duty. They've been lazy from the purely intellectual sense of finding out what it is that the people who purport to represent them are about. And that's actually a great tragedy. And it isn't only a tragedy for them. It's a tragedy for all of us. Because we're all going to have to suffer the consequences of what just happened. And the consequences will be deep, they will be abiding, and we won't be over them anytime soon. But I just want to say that to paint the situation with a really unduly broad brush that says this somehow was a vote by all the people who felt disenfranchised by their society in a genuine sense is to characterize the situation unfairly. Because it's more complicated than that, and in many ways I think it's much, much darker than that. So, those are my thoughts as I prepare to leave London and get on the plane and head home to what I think is a very uncertain future. And not simply a very uncertain future for me, someone who's had a great deal of privilege in his life, somebody who has often but not always perhaps taken that privilege for granted, but also uncertain for large masses of people, many of whom wish this very result upon all of us. Because I'm afraid and I'm saddened by the realization that in the next 6 months, in the next year, in the next 2 years, within the next 4 years, they're going to be deeply, deeply disappointed by what they have wrought. Anyway, that's enough. Good luck. See you soon.